Hello, and it's time again for another edition of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, Issues in Science Education, Part 4, Parents Who Care Too Much. So, we are finishing out the long July 4th weekend in 2019 as I record this. And this particular podcast topic is more or less the flip side of the previous podcast where I was talking about parents who didn't care enough. And while that topic is probably more understandable and makes sense to most of you, tonight's topic doesn't perhaps make as much sense. How can parents care too much? Well, that's what I'm here to tell you about. And if anything, this problem may be a bigger problem than the parents who don't care enough. And I've seen more of this at various levels of education than I thought I would ever see. So it does exist, and it's real, and I'll tell you what I'm meaning with respect to this. I'm talking about parents who maybe go by the term helicopter parents, parents who just kind of swoop in and get very much involved, almost being very invasive and very forceful with their child in various issues as they're growing up, and then disappear for a while. So it's the helicopter is at a given level, then suddenly it comes down when it feels it needs to defend the child or look out for the child's interests, and then comes back up. And in theory, that doesn't always sound so bad. But the question I have to pose tonight with respect to parents who care too much, what are they caring too much about? Are they really so concerned about the quality of their child's education or their child's progress? Or are they caring about their own egos? And I would submit to you that it is at least as much of the latter as the former, if not more of the latter. And I've encountered more of that, and I know some of my colleagues in education, whether it be at the college level or in K through 12, have encountered this as well. So let me give you some examples of how this can play out. So let's go up to the college level, where I've seen this perhaps most grievously displayed, and perhaps most inappropriately. So let's just, for the sake of argument, say there's a student named Johnny. Nice generic name, Johnny. If you're from another country and there are equivalents, such as in Spanish, you could say Juan, or Johan, or any other type of equivalent. Johnny will do for this particular podcast. So let's say that Johnny spent his entire college semester screwing around. This is not that uncommon, especially for kids who have had parents that have interceded for them repeatedly over the course of their history as a student. So Johnny spends the semester screwing around. He fails several subjects, and he might pass a couple of others with a D. Does Johnny really get a chance to learn his lesson and maybe realize he needs to study more, work harder, pay attention, ask questions in class, show up at class? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And sometimes no occurs when you have these parents that will swoop down in after ignoring all the signs of Johnny not doing well in college for the semester, ignore the fact that he didn't go to class, ignore the fact he didn't study. Half the time it's because they don't even know what the hell is going on with Johnny while he's at college. They take no interest until they see the report card, and suddenly D's and F's. And what goes through their head is something along the lines of, well, my Johnny can't possibly be getting these poor grades. He's such a smart boy. It must be that these teachers are just being so unreasonable, and they're giving him too much work, and they're giving him, just material that's just too hard for him. And if you think this is ridiculous, guess again. I've seen this come and play itself out at the college level. I've seen it come and play out even to a small degree at the graduate student level, and I've certainly seen it in the K through 12 level, though there are some other K through 12 issues that come into play, and there's even some other college issues here. So the question I pose to you is this parent really upset about Johnny's grades, or the fact that their son is doing so poorly and failing out of college, and it's an embarrassment to them? And while you might think that sounds shallow and self-absorbed and superficial, I submit to you that in certain cases that is exactly what's going on. And I've even talked with collegiate administrators who have had parents come to campus not to visit the classes, not to see really what their child is doing, but to go into an administrator's office and yell and scream at them that my child deserves better than these grades because he's my child, and in our social status and standing, we don't have children that fail. It gets that bad. In particular, during my time in North Georgia, I heard this refrain being repeated by administrators that I talked to, other of my colleagues that I talked to, and others within the collegiate system. Because in North Georgia, there's lots of old money, there's lots of tradition, the families always send their kids to the same school, and their kids send their kids to the same school, and everyone passes with flying colors because it's the family tradition, it's the family birthright. It doesn't really matter how well the kids do. So, where does this come into the actual quality of education? The problem is that there's no accountability in a system where you have parents coming in and yelling and screaming at administrators to change grades and pressuring faculty to change grades. And sometimes when the faculty don't change grades, the administrators break in to the system and change the grades anyway. And they figure no one's going to really be the wiser and check and call them to the carpet, even though they probably should be called to the carpet because it basically undermines the entire higher educational system. I have known teachers who have been adjuncts at the community colleges that I've taught at and other places that I've taught that have given me stories of similar things happening in high schools. Parents come and they bitch and moan to the superintendents, to the principals, to anybody on the school board who will listen, in particular if they have buddies and friends on the school board, they're country club pals, and they pressure the grades to be changed. And they put pressure on the teachers to not fail anybody because, God forbid, we have to have even more parents come in and bitch and moan at us. And the parents, they basically take the attitude, well, it's the school's fault, it's the teacher's fault. It's never their child's fault. Their child is never held responsible or accountable. And this is an issue not just in science education, it's across the board. But I've certainly seen it in my own capacity as a teacher of science. So this is a bigger issue than might be believed, except for the recent scandal that has occurred in terms of college admissions that deals with various celebrities who shall go unnamed in this podcast, lest they hear this podcast and start suing me. So I think everybody knows who's involved in these particular legal cases. Some of these celebrities may even go to jail for a little while, although they'll probably find a way to buy themselves off. They're pretty good about that. But it's basically the same idea and the same problem, that by peddling money, peddling influence, intimidation, we can circumvent the entire integrity of the educational system. And now that that's become such a public spectacle at the collegiate level, perhaps it's easier to believe at all levels. What we see more often in K through 12 is how this impacts the children's ability to play in sports, and how the parents who are living vicariously through their kids in terms of their sports activities to try and recapture past glories that they are well past, care about their kids' grades when their grades are bad and don't allow them to participate in sports. Just this past year, teaching at the middle school I was teaching at, I had several parents whose kids goofed off in class. They didn't take anything home to study before tests. They didn't do half of their work in class, and they didn't do well enough to participate in sports because there was a cutoff. Usually it was a C grade that was necessary, or at least passing for some of the sports. It varies from sport to sport. And there are checks that are done in the grade books basically every week by the coaches. And if you don't make the grade, you don't play. You don't play, suddenly then it's not the kid's fault. Then you as the teacher are getting called on the carpet by the parents because, well, sports are important to my kid, and it's your fault he's not able to play, and then I have to deal with him, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, why don't you deal with them to try and make sure that he or she does well enough? Why don't you care about the actual work and the grades and not about the sports and your own desire to live vicariously through your kids and only be proud of what your kids can accomplish through sports? Who cares about everything else? Good questions. Big issues. In all cases, there's pressure on teachers everywhere to fudge grades, inflate grades, and even just pretend like grades don't exist because of these parents who care too much, not necessarily about their kids, but about their own egos. More food for thought. I've got a couple more installments in this series before I'm going to wrap it up, but for now, I'm Dr. Jeff Tilley. This is the Daily Bolt. I hope you've enjoyed listening. If you like, you can become a patron of this podcast and help us continue on the air and maybe expand what we offer with a video format. But if not, we hope that you're getting something out of it nonetheless. Have a good night, good afternoon, good morning, and God bless.